This is episode 186 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Wally, it's good to be with you live and in person yet again as we wait out or plow through this coronavirus situation.
Yes, it's good to see people. I think they only exist on Zoom and Skype and things like that. So it's to see another human being. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I've had some nice happy hours with friends across the country on Skype, and all those online tools are definitely helpful. And it's great to relax a little bit and say hello to folks who maybe you don't even have conversations with outside of phone calls or even texts, but getting together online, if you can get everybody, is kind of neat. It's not quite like being there in person, but it's definitely better than the alternative, huh?
Yeah, and Carol and I did the daughters, stepdaughters, and son-in-laws and grandchildren Zoom meeting the other day, and we did it for about an hour. It was a lot of fun. The grandkids are like 1.5 and 4. They loved it, as did everybody. So yeah, we're doing what we can. So
exactly. Well, as we've been kind of quarantined as a state, not as bad as some other states, to be fair. And I will give Governor Lujan Grisham credit for not quite being maybe as extreme or unreasonable, I think, as some other states. Of course, we haven't had the same issues that other states, so it's a balancing act. But the fact is that we are moving through, a period of very constricted economic activity. Of course, oil prices have been way down. They bounced back up a little bit, but generally speaking, we're in a $20 range when it comes to oil prices. And Wally, you got to have the conversation in New Mexico about the budget situation. Santa Fe, New Mexican, March 31st, legislators, specifically John Arthur Smith, might as well just cut the BS. We're talking John Arthur Smith
he's the
here.
one.
New Mexico faces up to $2 billion budget hole. This is generally referring to fiscal year 2021, which begins at the beginning of July, so July 1st. We're still finishing out fiscal year 2020. I'm sure that there are some challenges there, but I think between federal stimulus package, unspent funds, money that can just be kind of juggled around, the governor is probably doing some of that. But $2 billion out of a $7.6 general fund budget is no joke. That is a serious hole. And, just your comments at this point.
Well, if you have something that's that big to be overcome, I think you ought to get working on that just as quick as you possibly can, because I think to put it off is the worst thing we could do. So $2 billion, that is a lot of money. And so that's basically the increase that's happened from the run up in oil and gas. Well, oil and gas is really hurting, so there won't be new gross receipts tax. But and I know we'll talk about this later, but New Mexico's economy has been really exposed for the lack of diversity when it comes to revenue sources that we have. And there's some that we probably should have that we don't, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But if I were to say just the underlying theme is we better pack a lunch, because it's going to take a while to figure out how to overcome a $2 billion deficit.
Yeah, and I don't lend too much credence to this report, but it just came up in the last hour or so I haven't really prepared to discuss it. But a report on Yahoo Finance, coronavirus will likely hit these states the hardest financially, according to Moody's. Now, Moody's is a analytics company. They're known mostly for their debt ratings. They claim, and based on the data, is it GIGO? Is it garbage in, garbage out? Right. I would say that it probably is, but based on their approach, they're claiming that states that are relying on tourism. Now, there's no doubt that Las Vegas and other states that have large tourism industries are going to be impacted, but I don't think they appropriately weight New Mexico's reliance on oil and gas and what that is going to do to us. I would like more approaches, maybe different data to be used, but I think New Mexico is going to be throttled here. In the Moody's report, we're actually among the states that does pretty well. It's Nevada, Hawaii, Washington State, New York State, Florida. Those are the ones that are seen in this report to be particularly hard hit. But I think they may not be quite aware of just how much the oil and gas situation is going to impact New Mexico.
Yes, and if oil and gas was in relatively normal times, I would say that report would be pretty accurate with regard to what New Mexico could expect. But they are not normal times for oil and gas. It's the lowest prices we've seen in, basically 2 generations. It's been a long time since the price has been this low, and it's going to have a huge impact on New Mexico. I always said, but for the coronavirus, the price of oil in the oil and gas industry would probably be front page 3 times a week in New Mexico, and you've barely seen anything about it. But that's something that's going to have to be addressed when it comes to the fiscal realities once this coronavirus issue is somewhat past us, or at least there's some renewal of economic activity and things like restaurants and tourism's legal again and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the oil and gas alone would be enough to necessitate a special session in the state of New Mexico, let alone all of the restrictions, the financial impositions that being stuck at home and all the sports and all the tourism, everything that's been postponed or completely canceled, those would also be serious factors. But Wally, I know we're going to move forward at some point with a special session, and there are plenty of people in New Mexico, of course, mostly on the political left, maybe not entirely, but mostly, that are calling for higher taxes. And I want to, of course, we'll say it, that is not our preferred mode going forward. We don't think that taxes should be considered as a vehicle to address this current situation. Definitely worst case scenario, but we've got a long way to go. A lot of spending needs to be cut. A lot of government efficiency needs to be implemented and addressed before we get to, let's raise taxes to solve the budget problem. But I want to get your take on the tax increase. You said you had a specific point to make.
Well, yeah, my take on that is, and I felt this way for quite a while. It's like the interaction between the state of New Mexico's budget and the business and free market economics it has in the state. And, the question you could come down to is the government there to support a free market economy? And when I support, say, have policies and procedures that allow that to thrive and to go forward, or does the free market economy exist to support the government? And those are very important questions when you get down to it. And, being a New Mexican and being in the legislature around that for about a decade now, I'm struck that when we talk about diversifying our economy, a lot of times it's diversification for the purpose of funding state government, not diversification of the economy to have a stronger economy. I'm not saying the two aren't related, but we have some issues to address as a state. And now that we're going to have such a huge deficit, even the most Keynesian economist among us would say that you don't raise taxes in the midst of what's going to be, the mother of all recessions, if not a depression, economically with what's going on with the coronavirus. And so will state government be able to, and will the approach be to adjust state government so that we get rid of some of the fat, we make it so it's as efficient as possible so that it maximizes the benefit to the entire populace? Or are you and I, who don't work for the government, is our job to pay our fair share and buck up the state government so they don't have to make these tough calls and these tough decisions here in the next 1, 2, 3, really several years in the future?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about those fractures and dynamics in New Mexico because there is a group of hard left progressives that definitely view government, they would never say it, but they see government as a parasite, essentially. They actually just see the private sector as the host and government is the one that they're trying to grow and make bigger and bigger, and that we just serve that entity that's government that sucks the strength out of the private sector. That's definitely a prevailing attitude among many in the legislature, and there's going to be a battle this fall over putting more people like that in the legislature. Right now, I think with this issue, we are going to see the true colors of our governor play themselves out because governors, first and foremost, as a general rule, have a self-perception, and rightfully so, as being concerned about the entire state. They have to be more sensitive than an individual legislator representing a small area about trying to get the overall economy moving. They want to do things that are good for the state as a whole. And there are elements, and I'll recite a tweet here from Bill Jordan, the one of many antagonists to the Rio Grande Foundation, definitely of the philosophy that government should dominate this relationship and the private sector is an inconvenience and, we'll kind of suck them dry, so to speak. Here's a tweet that he wrote. New Mexico paid a steep price for the austerity of the Great Recession, and some in the legislature are talking the same playbook, wanting to roll back some of the education and healthcare gains of the past year. If this crisis is teaching us anything, it's that building stronger New Mexico, they're always touting stronger New Mexico, is essential. So I, essentially responded to him saying, first and foremost, the time for the issues they care about, the time recovering from the Great Recession was not a period of true austerity. Governor Martinez, much to our distress, expanded Medicaid. That was healthcare is one of their big issues, and we saddled up to the trough and are expanding Medicaid. She also spent dramatically on early childhood, which is one of the voices and the far left's main policy goals. So the idea that there was a period of austerity in New Mexico's recent history on those big picture issues is simply not true. But let's talk about let's get back to the tax increase issue, because I could go on about Voices for Children all afternoon. So that's clearly setting up, though, the discussion for raised taxes. So this is where the governor is going to come into play. She's got people in the Senate, John Arthur Smith among them, who said recently in a story I was also in for Channel 4 News that he was not inclined to raise taxes. And if the Senate Finance Committee chairman is not inclined to raise taxes, that's a very good sign for us in the conservative camp. There's people in the House, including Javier Martinez, who essentially sings from the Voices playbook, who definitely would like to raise taxes, as would the Voices folks and kind of the left-leaning progressives, especially in the House. But on the issue of taxes, so I'm sharing a report that we're going to link to in the show notes from the Mercatus Center. They rank the states on their fiscal outlooks. That's a lot of different things, but I'll read briefly from the New Mexico page. Mercatus Center, they're free market, but they're very green eye shades in their approach. On the basis of its solvency in 5 separate categories, New Mexico ranks 45th among U.S. states for fiscal health. This is from 2018. And it talks about those specific areas. Cash solvency. Do we have enough cash to cover our short-term bills? We're 21st, so not too bad. Budget solvency. Did we run any shortfalls in the last year? This is 2018 again. We were 43rd, so not so good. Long run solvency measures whether a state has a hedge against large long term liabilities. We're 14th. Here's the one I want to talk about: service level solvency. How high are taxes, revenues, and spending when compared to state personal income? In other words, do states have enough fiscal slack? If spending commitments demand more revenues, are states in a good position to increase taxes without harming the economy? 50th. We are absolutely at the very bottom. Sometimes, and to cap off this particular conversation, I know I opened up many cans of worms throughout it, but we are often labeled as a low tax state because we don't have heavy taxes in terms of the rates. They're not readily apparent on average New Mexicans. But we are a poor state, and those taxes impact people more heavily, more directly than they do in many other states. And I just think that even if I was not libertarian, free market, conservative, just looking at the situation politically, economically, tax increases of any significance would be a huge mistake for this governor and for the legislature when they do come to Santa Fe.
Yeah, there's a few thoughts that popped in my mind. One that continually pops into my mind is the little thing called the Laffer curve. Just by raising tax rates does not mean you're going to raise revenue if it stifles economic activity. And New Mexico has to be very wary of that, because the other thing that popped in my mind is the fact that businesses, particularly those that are looking to grow or expand, vote with their feet if they don't like the tax policy of what's happening here. Now, because we're very reliant on oil and gas, and once you drill a hole in the ground that's pumping oil, you're not going anywhere if you're going to stay in that business. But with oil and gas hurting so poorly, other industries like manufacturing, business services, etc., may be way more important, and will be as a percentage wise, even if they just stay where they are now relative to the other big industries dropping off. And so those are two things to really be concerned about. If you could just raise tax rates and everything would get better, you would do that ad infinitum. And that's what Mr. Laffer, or Dr. Laffer, addressed, was the fact there comes a point where raising those rates does not produce you more revenue. And then the final one is there's certain kinds of taxes that we're very poorly positioned even if we raise the rates. The first is gross receipts tax, because we took gross receipts tax on the only thing that people are really buying in reckless abandon, and that is food and groceries from grocery stores. We took the tax off of that. You still pay gross receipts tax on restaurants, but with the exception of drive-thrus, that's way down. Tourism is way down. Hotel stays are way down. So that's an area where, you can raise the gross receipts tax, but it may not do as much good as you think. And back to your issue of the Mercatus report, is a very regressive tax. It hurts. It hurts the lower income people more than the upper income people. And then, lest you think that we're going to balance our books on the backs of a business income tax increase, you don't have to look back too many years in the 2007, 8, and 9 period, where they were looking at what corporate income taxes provide to the state budget in New Mexico. Very low amount of revenue. And so you can raise that rate. Well, who would pay that in normal years would be the folks in the oil and gas industry who are corporations. But they're not going to have, if you don't have income, net income, income tax does not matter. It doesn't matter what the rate is. So there are a lot of things there where we are going to have to be very careful, because it's the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. There's a huge opportunity to make our very bad economic situation way worse with very cumbersome and clumsy. Almost coined a new word. Cumbersome policy.
Yeah. There is a lot to consider, and I just think it would be a terrible mistake to raise taxes for a variety of reasons. You need businesses, going concerns to be doing well enough, period. And raising taxes would not do much for them. You're right though. Some of the big businesses that do pay taxes in New Mexico are going to be paying a lot less tax, even corporate income tax, personal income tax. Those numbers are going to plummet along with every other form of tax revenue. So there's going to be some challenges. And this is, in many ways, this is an opportunity for us at the Rio Grande Foundation to push back against some spending that, quite frankly, has been going on in this state since before Michelle Lujan Grisham, although she built significantly in terms of the size of government. Governor Martinez, she tried on some of the things like film industry, film subsidies. She didn't do anything about the Rail Runner, but the Rail Runner is shut down currently. Does anybody miss it? And the back to the Bill Richardson days of the gross receipts tax swap on groceries. The only thing that makes me hesitate to mention that is that can easily be turned into a revenue raiser. Oh, just slap the rate back on the gross receipts on groceries right now. We're not going to exempt anything or reduce the rate on other items, because that's what happened when they put it on. They took it off of groceries and then they raised the other rate. At this point, given the financial picture, I doubt we would see a decline subsequent with the raising of the price of groceries. But anyway, if legislators share our views, or potential legislators, candidates listening to this podcast, they can check out the Americans for Tax Reform pledge not to raise taxes. Federal candidates, U.S. Senate, House of Representatives can all sign on as well. ATR.org/take-the-pledge. But if you go to Americans for Tax Reform, ATR.org, you can find the pledge there. And I encourage everybody who wants to run for office to sign said pledge, because we do not need higher taxes, especially in New Mexico, especially at this time. Speaking of tax hikers and the kinds of folks who, if they get their way in November, could truly demolish New Mexico as a going concern, as a state. I'm talking about a group of so-called progressives, progressing towards socialism, and they've been covered in a few different stories. This one's from the April 4th edition of the Santa Fe New Mexican. These folks are calling themselves no corporate Democrats. That by itself is a problem, but they are targeting 5 Democrat senators, and they're trying to go after folks who they believe are somehow too conservative for their taste, and they're trying to replace them with what I can only describe as extreme left-wing, socialist-leaning Bernie Sanders type so-called progressives.
Yeah, it's very disturbing because the policies they advocate are ever-increasing taxes. And lest you think things can never get worse, there are scenarios that I've been working on. Interestingly, Paul, I did some things like 25 years ago about the vulnerability of New Mexico's economy relative to things. And one of the scenarios that we developed way, way, way back then was the scenario where the federal government basically didn't have as much money to put into New Mexico. And then New Mexico would raise their taxes, driving businesses off. Then they would raise them again, driving them further off. And so the point is that there's much that can be done to help recovery, but there's a lot that can be done that's damaging to recovery and maybe would, call into question the going concern nature of the state. And I don't think this is this next year per se. There's a lot of things to be worked out on the $2 billion. But if we get to where we're going to tax more things on gross receipts, raise the tax, raise our state income taxes on personal income and on business income, there's not many things that are left to tax here in New Mexico that you could tax And as I said, many of those are very fragile. And if you put a lot more cost on there, you could drive a lot of business activity out of the state elsewhere.
Yeah, the five senators in the crosshairs include John Arthur Smith, of course, Senate Finance Committee chairman, and somebody who, while we would definitely argue is by no means a fiscal conservative in the Rio Grande Foundation mold, is at least a voice of reason in Santa Fe. Senate President Pro Tem Mary Kay Papen, she performed very poorly in our Freedom Index rankings, and we've been tracking this for a while now. I would not call Mary Kay Papen a fiscal conservative in any serious context. It's to the extent that she is, she's more maybe of a social conservative, and that's something that certainly these people have a right to go after them on. But it's just funny that they're going with the no corporate label, and their two main issues are early childhood education and abortion, which, as far as I can tell, not many corporations really care one way or the other about early childhood learning as a yes or a no issue. And abortion is definitely not a corporate issue. But you pick the label that you think is going to sell the best, whether it makes any sense or not. Clemente Sanchez, who definitely is a little bit more moderate than maybe some of the others. Gabriel Ramos of Silver City, I think that's a purely abortion-related play. And George Munoz of Gallup, who, again, he's moderate, but hardly a fiscal conservative. We did work with him, as did some of the people who would likely be in this coalition on pension reform this session, which is one of the few dollar line items that I hope that they are able to fulfill. There's something like $72 million that's going to be required to start that transition, and that's going to be a much tougher line item to fill. But yeah, it's just the thing that I look at is, well, New Mexico's major corporate welfare program is the film industry, benefits mostly out-of-state major Hollywood companies. I'm sure these no corporate Democrats are vehemently anti-film subsidy, right, Wally?
Yeah, that's probably not the case, although they will have to provide a list of where they think all these inappropriate corporate benefits are coming from.
No doubt about it.
Yeah, but yes, they didn't mean that for some reason. I just have a feeling.
Unfortunately, I think you're right. It's just the way it is.
The other thing that strikes me about the marketing of this group, it's almost like they've taken a national progressive campaign and applied it to the state of New Mexico. And I say that in that they act like maybe modern monetary theory is in play in New Mexico. And it would be if New Mexico had its own currency and we could print more money. We can't. We have a nominal balanced budget amendment. Now, there are things like unfunded pensions that go away that are not included in that calculation. But at least when it comes to general fund spending on an annual basis, we're supposed to, by constitution, balance the books. And for whatever reason, this group seems to act like there's all of this money that could be scraped from the private sector in New Mexico, that somehow we are not doing it. And it's just very interesting, the take. And I say maybe they didn't take a national approach and do things, but it sure felt a lot like that to me.
Well, we may be about to see whether modern monetary theory works in Washington, D.C., where at least they do print the currency, and some would say we have unlimited ability to do so. Certainly, New Mexico is not able to do such things. In fact, I've been doing a lot of analysis and was on a webcast looking at the real funding challenges that face our K-12 system. Earlier, Wally mentioned exempting groceries from taxation. under Bill Richardson. That is resonating not only through state budgets, but especially local budgets, especially rural communities where maybe all you have is a grocery store. You know, the Family Dollar that everybody likes to make fun of or ridicule. All the groceries are no longer being taxed, Walmarts, et cetera, et cetera. And restaurants, of course, they're not even open to an extent. So those taxes are going away. Also, gross receipts taxes are a more volatile form of taxation. They respond immediately to economic downturns, especially this kind of retail-driven downturn. Our statewide education funding formula is going to exacerbate that problem because what does hold up in a budget crunch? Well, property taxes tend to be less vulnerable to those kinds of radical swings. Of course, New Mexico is one of the states that originated the statewide funding formula to even things out with poorer areas. But the fact is that statewide funding formula, we are more reliant on our statewide funding formula, according to a chart that I posted at heirsoфenchantment.com. We are more reliant statewide than any other state besides Vermont and Hawaii. 70%, according to this, comes through the state of New Mexico. So we're overwhelmingly state-funded education system. And this is all going to impact New Mexico rather significantly, and I think we're going to be dealing with this challenge for not just the rest of 2020, but into 2021 and potentially beyond, depending on oil prices.
Yes, and it is very possible that we could see movement to raise real estate taxes, property taxes in New Mexico as a result, because they are not low by any stretch of the imagination, but relative to many surrounding states that rely on property taxes much more to fund state government. Places like the little state to the east of us, Texas, has a lot higher property tax rates. Ours are relatively moderate. And you are right, they are much more stable. And the ramifications of the funding formula is in a place like Texas, school funding is much more locally funded. Mm-hmm. It doesn't flow through Austin nearly to the extent it flows through Santa Fe like it does here in New Mexico. And there's lots of reasons we use the statewide funding formula, one of which is we have so much federal government land here. There are certain counties that have almost no property that they can tax because there's no private property or very limited amounts of private property in those counties. Now, the federal government, as they always do, they come up with a program, and they have certain programs that they provide in lieu of property taxes to a state and local government. But sort of like when New Mexico did the hold harmless when we changed the gross receipts tax. People seem to forget that one of the things was that we're going to take the gross receipts tax off of food, but the legislature was going to step into the balancing authority and make these counties and cities whole. Well, that lasted a few years, and they realized they couldn't afford to do that. Well, these in lieu of property taxes are nice for the counties where they come. So for Forest Service land, BLM land, but it pales in the amount of money that would likely come through if all that land was privately owned and they were able to have economic activity on that and tax it that way.
Yeah, no doubt. Plastic bags remain a significant issue, ever changing. Of course, as we mentioned on the last podcast, the mayor of Albuquerque, Tim Keller, put the bag ban on hold locally here in the city for 30 days. We applauded him for that, but then he, of course, made some Weasley-style statements, just not trying to besmirch the reputations of weasels. But he said, it had nothing to do with the virus and potential germ spreading. It also, he said, is going to come back worse and more aggressive with the thicker bags that are often sold now for a dime at the local grocery stores, that those are going to be banned. Well, more developments have been going on, including Bernalillo County has gone ahead and given its ban a waiver for 60 days, which is great. And the quote from Julie Morgas Baca, the county manager there, directly quoted in the very short press release, said, "In the interest of safety during the coronavirus COVID-19 shutdown, I've lifted the ban on these single-use bags." So the county would take some issue there with Mayor Keller. And I think Mayor Keller is probably going to have to backtrack on the 30-day ban. I think he's going to probably have to move it at least to 60 days.
So what did he say? It wasn't to do with coronavirus.
It was in solidarity with grocery workers who are being, working hard, admittedly, very hard.
And exposed to coronavirus by dirty bags people are bringing in.
One of those things, yes.
He said part of it. He didn't
Yes.
say all of it. Okay, I got it.
In solidarity with the grocery workers.
All right,
That's
well,
what Keller
good. Well,
said.
and I'm in solidarity with them too. And lest we think this is the final epidemic or pandemic, I think that it did expose a very important public safety issue. A lot of public safety issues are being exposed by what's going on with the coronavirus, and don't think that there couldn't be a foodborne or one that transmits easily in your dirty grocery bags to come about. So very interesting. So we'll see. It's good to know that they're in solidarity and that we can use plastic bags for a while.
Yeah, but the news gets better, Wally, because if Santa Fe is doing something on plastic bags, I mean, that is the green.
It's serious.
The green capital of New Mexico, the city different. Mayor Alan Weber, who of course has progressive credentials, next to no one. He's as progressive as they come. We've debated a couple different times in public forums. A very smart man though, and businessman even, which can't believe that somebody of that business background would be so left of center. But he is quoted in a Santa Fe, New Mexican story that posted today. "On one hand, our grocery stores and supermarkets are essential," Alan Weber said. "If we don't limit customer and employee interactions and customer-to-customer interactions, they risk being high transference sites. Ergo, not only does the county, Bernalillo County, disagree with Mayor Keller, but the progressive mayor of the progressive city different in Santa Fe, Alan Weber, acknowledges that there are issues with transference of viruses, and they have put their bag ban on hold. I don't know if they have a time frame, but it's officially hit Santa Fe, Wally. I think this is a red letter day.
Yes, and we will see how quickly they retreat from this. But you read more and more articles about the fundamental changes that this COVID-19 coronavirus will bring to the American economy and our way of life. And excuse me. Sorry about that. That was a sneeze.
Not
a
coronavirus,
cough, not a
yes.
coronavirus. Bad allergies. Sorry about that. I think that this may need a good solid looking at. And they say there's no studies about the germs. Well, let's do a study on the germs of
Well, there
the
has
bag.
been a study. I cited it in my
I
report,
know.
which we received a positive mention in an editorial from the Albuquerque Journal. So that was very pleasing. And, it's always been a challenge based here in New Mexico to achieve victories on financial and regulatory policies because this is such a state dominated by progressive left-wingers. The good thing, I guess, out of this is that we've seen that if they are presented with solid health evidence, and they are already taking plenty of steps to address the health issue. I'm sure Mayor Keller, Mayor Weber, Bernalillo County, they would all love to see the money flowing in to their coffers from people out and about spending and doing all the things they normally do, but they genuinely feel, whether the science is truly there or not, that they have to do what they are doing. So I think they feel like the bags have to at least be a temporary switch. But of course, moving forward, it's not like coronavirus is the only virus or there's bacteria as well.
Right.
There's other ways in which people can get sick. This definitely puts a significant hole in the case, so to speak, for forcing people to use reusable bags or some other method of getting their groceries out of the supermarket. It really is going to be, I think, tougher than they think to reimpose this as we return to some normalcy.
Yeah, and as we've talked, the analog in places like Starbucks, when they were open, is they stopped refusing outside containers because they didn't want things being brought into their facilities that they didn't have control of. So there are ways to do sterilization, ozone, and different other things. And I am not advocating any one. I've not done the study. But I think just bringing any old bag into a grocery store, I'm with you. I'm not sure that that's going to be a very good strategy going forward. And I think there's going to be a lot of pushback if they just say, well, let's go back. You know, coronavirus is largely slowed down. So let's just go back to the no single-use plastic bag prohibition that we've had in places like Albuquerque.
Yeah, and speaking of getting rid of unnecessary regulations, and hopefully some of these kinds of regulations can be permanently eliminated moving forward. The Americans for Tax Reform, again, Grover Norquist and his group, ATR.org. This time you can go to atr.org/rules. They are collecting, at this point, they have 171 federal and state regulations that have been waived to fight the virus. Everything from the FDA allowing states leeway in virus testing to the, a lot of FDA, not all test kits being required to be sent to a CDC, Centers for Disease Control lab, various state regulations. Even Governor Lujan Grisham allowed overweight vehicles. You have weight restrictions on highways. If they're carrying relief supplies, Governor Lujan Grisham, in a very worthwhile approach to this issue, waived some of the weight restrictions. She's allowing expedited applications for those exemptions. In California, progressive state, departments may waive any professional licensing and certification requirements to expand scope of care. That's for healthcare workers. And I think that's something that we should be doing here as well, is really, if you're a doctor who can practice in Colorado or Texas or Oklahoma or Florida or Mississippi or wherever, you should be able to transfer that to New Mexico and get to work here in our state. But Americans for Tax Reform is collecting this nationwide list of worthwhile efforts to pull back on some of the unnecessary regulations that dominate our day-to-day lives and the economy. And, obviously we're in a crisis. We're all doing these things partially because it's a crisis, but there are a lot of policies that are just in place because some special interest got them there. I know with Carol White, last week we talked about delivery of liquor from restaurants, that would be helpful right now. The governor still has not acted, to my knowledge. It's something that should be done just as a general rule. Now, how many people are going to get delivery of liquor when times are normal from your restaurants? Not as many, but it is what it is, and it's something that should be repealed. The government shouldn't be mandating that. But all right, Wally, thank you very much, and thanks for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.